Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Wakumi Douglas, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am co-founder and executive director of Soul Sisters Leadership Collective and a founding member of the South Florida Racial Justice Table. Thank you for joining us for this press conference focused on the disparities, the racial disparities facing organizations focused on racial justice and Black-led organizations here in South Florida. Today, I'm standing with 8 other Black-led and racial justice organizations, as well as the freedom fighters who came before us to say to the philanthropic and funding community in South Florida that when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean Black organizations matter too. The South Florida Racial Justice Table began convening about 6 weeks ago after learning we had all been awarded the first grants from the Miami Foundation's Racial Equity Fund. And we applaud the Miami Foundation's initial step. We truly do. We also recognize that it's only a drop in the bucket in comparison to what is needed to right the historic wrongs against Black people in South Florida. Of the $100,000 commitment, each of our organizations was awarded $5,000. The Racial Justice Table's purpose at this time is to collaborate with philanthropic allies and organize others in philanthropy to fill the resource gap facing Black-led organizations. In using the term racial justice to describe our table, we recognize that from enslavement to Black voter suppression to Jim Crow, to the sexual abuse to maternal mortality pipeline, to mass incarceration, Black people have been historically denied time and time again over centuries our human rights in this country. And yes, here in South Florida as well. And all the while, white and wealthy people are benefiting from our oppression. Said plainly, the only wealth attainable in this country is gained on the backs of Black people and on the stolen land of Indigenous people. So this is not about handouts or guilt, it's about justice. It's about righting centuries of wrongs. It's about just redistribution of wealth, and the time is now. For far too long, we have witnessed a widening resource gap among nonprofit organizations in South Florida, with white and white-led and white-passing Latinx-led organizations and social service organizations accessing larger and more consistent funding than Black-led organizations and organizations focused on systems change. And this matches the national trend. I want to share some research. In a June 2020 study, they reported that unrestricted net assets of Black-led organizations are 76% smaller than their white-led counterparts. Another 2020 study found a $20 million funding gap between white and Black-led early-stage organizations in favor of white-led groups. And that at the mezzanine level, Black-led groups get only 4% of funding. A 2019 study found that less than 1/4 of Black-led organizations have the financial means to sustain an unexpected financial hardship without having to make significant adjustments to their operations and programming. This underinvestment, in addition to being plainly unjust, creates additional stress on organizational leadership and staff and tears our focus away from deep dives into the innovative solutions to address racialized violence and injustice in this country. Additionally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the majority of leaders speaking today, my comrades who I'm sitting on this live stream with today, are nationally recognized for our leadership in racial justice and other arenas. We are flown across the country and in some cases around the world to share our expertise. However, here in South Florida, we remain unseen, underfunded, and consistently denied access to investment. So I want to say a couple things about the principles of racial justice funding from our perspective, and there are numerous. I just want to highlight a couple in my remarks before I pass it off to my esteemed colleagues and comrades. One principle is intersectionality. Funding approaches must understand intersectionality. Black people are women, and Black people are queer and trans, and Black people have disabilities, and Black people are immigrants. Black people sit at the intersections of a lot of identities. Often funders have a very narrow vision of what racial justice looks like, generally focused on cis Black men, straight Black men. As an example, Soul Sisters has an innovative program, Circles Not Cells, to reduce rearrests among girls in the legal system. Recidivism numbers are quite high among girls. We have been fundraising among funders with a racial equity focus for 2 years, and what have we been hearing? We don't fund youth, or we don't fund girls. We urge funders to consider all Black people in racial justice funding approaches, particularly considering the Black feminist principle that we create a world that is safe and well-resourced. When we create a world that is safe and well-resourced for the most marginalized and most harmed by oppression, we all benefit. Systems change has to be the center of the funding approaches. We deserve longer-term, consistent investments in policy and organizing, community development, and youth leadership development that will actually uproot structural racism. To illustrate this more clearly, I want to share a story that I learned from Marian Wright Edelman. So here's the story. Imagine one day you walk by a stream in your community and you see a baby in the river drowning. You jump in, you pull the baby out, you make sure they're alive, you get them safe and with loving adults, and you continue your life. The next day, the same thing happens, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. One day you see 5 babies in the river. The next day you see 10 babies in the river. So you organize a baby rescue operation. You are all pulling babies out of the river, setting up safety stations, feeding stations, family reunification programs, clothing donation areas. You develop a full-scale baby saving operation. Resources are being funneled into this work, and the operation is basically perfect, but the babies keep drowning. One day someone asks, where are all these babies coming from? How are they getting here? Maybe we should go upstream to stop the babies from getting thrown in the river to begin with. Our organizations are upstream organizations. We are seeking to get to the root of issues facing Black people. These are the solutions that will end housing instability. We have solutions that will end mass incarceration. We have solutions to end sexual violence. We have solutions to end school pushout, to end maternal mortality among Black birthing people. All of these wins are possible with the right investment. Another important principle is community control. We have donor-advised funds. They've been in the news quite a bit recently. We say, what about community-advised funds? What about funds controlled by members of the Black community to be invested in the areas that we know need innovation because we're directly impacted by these issues? So we know where the investment is needed. If we want to build political power in our communities, we must have decision-making power in the redistribution of resources at a community level. Beyond just participating in voting and feedback sessions, it's time for us to mutually build towards Black self-determination in Black communities. The last principle I want to talk about is support innovation and take risks. We call for funding innovation. In the tech arena, app developers get literally tens of millions of dollars for innocuous apps that don't address social problems. Pizza delivery apps, movie apps, all kind of other things. These companies fail and investors never see $1 as a return on their investment. But these investments keep getting made. Meanwhile, those of us seeking to free this country from centuries of racialized violence are begging for a few $1,000s and can't get it. In a capitalist society, money talks. Where we put our dollars signifies whose leadership we value and whose leadership we do not. Where we put our dollars shows the kind of change we are seeking, whether we want downstream solutions, Band-Aid solutions, or structural and systemic changes, upstream solutions. During today's press conference, you will hear more from my amazing comrades in racial justice work about our experiences being underfunded in South Florida and our invitation to Philanthropy to join us in addressing racial disparities in funding. So with that, I am going to pass the mic to Ruth Jean-Noel, founder and executive director of Famsaj.
Thank you, Wakumi. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruth Jean-Noel. I am a longtime organizer in Miami, Florida, and also a cross-movement builder. I currently serve as the executive director and founder of Famsaj. Famsaj in Haitian Creole means midwife. It could also mean wise women. So what we'll say is midwives catch babies, and Famsaj, we catch communities. I'm also a founding member of the South Florida Racial Justice Table, and really happy to be here and honored to be here with my colleagues. So I'd like to start off by sharing that community organizing and racial justice takes commitment, a commitment to a vision of seeing social change. And for me, it is a commitment to seeing a world where Black communities across the African diaspora feel empowered to determine for themselves how they want to live. For many of us on this call, this is just not just work, but it is a lifestyle. A lifestyle takes commitment, a commitment to talking to new people, a commitment to leadership development, a commitment to sharing the patterns of injustice, and also teaching people that the conditions that they are currently living in have been preset for them due to white supremacy. A commitment to transformation, and a commitment to practicing the world that we actually want to see, and a lifestyle of healing. So we've seen commitment in a lot of forms in our organizations. The people who are directly impacted have been committed. Organizations here for a long time have been committed. And we've even seen national organizations come to Miami to express their and share the commitment with us. So a little bit of the history of community organizing that we could share is that it's definitely existed before many of our organizations were even formed. So even if we go back to the 1800s when enslaved Africans and Black Seminoles joined hand in hand to fight against oppression and become what we know now as the Maroons. Many of the organizations represented here today have held the commitment of social justice, with Haitians or Haitians seeking refuge migrating to Haiti, to the McDuffie riots, to fighting to end the school to prison pipeline and pushing for alternatives like restorative justice, and moving towards healing justice and wellness, which is really for us and by us. And the evolution of organizing has continued, it's grown, but the commitment has remained consistent. And usually local resources, foundations, philanthropy, they follow the movement to build and sustain long-lasting communities for social change. Unfortunately, that has not been the case for our local foundations. So it's important to also recognize that Black lives, they don't just matter now, but that they've always mattered to us. And as we continue to lay out the problem and bring out the solutions today, we ask ourselves, what's a consistent commitment from philanthropy in Miami? Because we know for sure that our movement will remain consistent because our lives depend on it. And our question for you all is, will you? And a lot of times as a storyteller, truth teller, and practitioner of restorative justice, we use nature and the reflection of nature in the work that we do. So if you can imagine looking outside and looking at nature, what we'll see is some plants that grow here in Miami. We'll see vervine, we'll see mint, we'll see different plants, different herbs that grow here. If we go to Oakland, it's not the same kind of plants that we see in Oakland that grow in Miami. If we go to New York, it's not the same. And so the reality for us is we also ask this of you all to also lean in with us in building and nurturing here, that we don't have to depend on other institutions to nurture us and build us, but that we're depending and asking that commitment from you all. So with that being said and sharing that, I will pass it over to Fran, who's going to take us through the rest.
Hi, I'm Francesca Menace, co-founder and board chair for the Black Collective. And Understanding Miami-Dade County, from Little Havana, Little Haiti, the Goulds, Homestead, Alapata, Overtown, Liberty City, and across the county. Miami-Dade communities are segregated and siloed across racial and ethnic lines. Our built environment, our lived experiences have shaped our current realities. For far too long, we've acknowledged our diversity, but never how disconnected we are from each other. As we work to transform our communities, it is important that philanthropy centers, collaborates, and fund Black-led organizations working towards our collective liberation, fighting for justice at the intersections of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and much more. Philanthropy must also acknowledge the history of giving white-passing Latinx and white-led organizations, capitalizing on our Black experiences, our trauma, our pain, and our growth. Many of these organizations have toxic work cultures that upholds white supremacy while benefiting from the labor of Black bodies. Funding shouldn't be contingent on institutional relationships. Rather, it should be focused on impact, expertise, with a commitment to directly impacted communities. It's always frustrating and frankly embarrassing that national funders support and value our work, our expertise, and our impact, but yet local funders don't. I can say, having recently experienced this through our organization, when it came to the census funding and how it was decided and how it was allocated. And after the funding was dashed out, and we wondered what happened when we, as the Black Collective, had already received funding from national organizations as well as other state-based organizations, and hearing from funders that we should have picked up the phone, that we should have called them, we should have let them know that we as the Black Collective were applying for those funds. And for us, we were kind of taken aback because we wanted to do things the right way. We wanted to apply, show our work, and make sure that the people who are actually reviewing and granting these funds are actually taking the time to look at the work that we are committed to doing in our communities. So having foundations tell us that it was just as simple as making a phone call because we had the institutional relationships, what about those organizations who don't have that access? What does that mean for them when they're left out of this conversation because everything is about who you know, not what you're doing, and ultimately what we need to do in our community. We are calling for accountability in philanthropy and how they show up for our communities. We are challenging funders to resource differently, evaluating organizational cultures, the makeup of the staffing and leadership, and relationships to directly impacted communities. And now I'm going to pass it on to Sandra Dennis.
Thank you so much, Fran. My name is Sandra Dennis, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Miami Workers Center. We know that being anti-Black, and the racism that we experience in South Florida, that doesn't only happen here, but it happens all throughout this country and in the world. And it's the bedrock of every single social justice issue philanthropy tries to address, be it housing, education, wages, gender justice, civic engagement, LGBTQI plus freedom, immigration, hunger, poverty, culture, you name it. Anti-Black racism, again, is the bedrock of all of these issues. However, organizations that center the lived experiences, leadership, and communities of Black people in Miami-Dade County often lack this very funding to do that very work. Anti-Blackness shows up in the types of groups that are funded and how those groups must be structured. It shows up in how the work of the grantee partners is evaluated and the ones that are criticized and or praised. We know that race is complicated in Miami-Dade County. It's not a Black and white thing. It's It can be very complicated. I'll say that again. But we know that the organizations such as ours that are on this press conference today, we do the work to really dismantle these issues that put our communities in such a vulnerable position that we often don't get the support, we don't get the praise, we're not hired, we're undervalued in these spaces. And with that, I'll pass it to James.
Thank you, Chantra. Hello, everyone. My name is James Lopez. I'm the Executive Director of Power Youth Center for Social Change. We're an organization that develops the leadership of working class Black and Brown youth to win material changes in their neighborhoods. And I'm grateful to be on the call with my comrades because for centuries, we have been trained to view deep systemic problems as problems of the individual. We look at segregated Black neighborhoods that have been intentionally divested from underfunded schools, low-paying jobs, to lack of affordable housing. And we are all trained in our jobs, in our education system, to believe that not only is this normal, but it is because there is something wrong with us. And of course, when we see a tragedy in our own neighborhoods, when we see one of our children killed due to gun violence, to Wakumi's story, when we see one of our babies in the river, the discussion is never about what factors created such a scenario. We are trained to internalize it as there is something wrong with us, that there's a cultural thing happening, that there are just bad people in this world and bad people in our neighborhoods, that we don't care about our communities. That's because we dress a certain way or wear our hair a certain way. Even in 2020, this is still things that are being perpetuated. And what is the proposed and respective solutions locally? We are told that we should just encourage people to behave better. Or at best, we are given access to some services that can help people meet some of their basic needs. And this is a sentiment that is prioritized and pushed by local philanthropy. And while we recognize here that providing services is important, we definitely believe that in 2020, amidst a global pandemic, amidst uprisings in response to police violence, amidst unprecedented moments in our generation's history, conversations about why our folks need these services is long overdue. We in this formation aspire for a vision of the world where our people do not need services, do not need someone to give them services, but that they can actually self-determine, they can build up and govern their own communities. And that's not possible if we do not invest and pay more attention to system change work. That's your community organizer, your neighborhood collectives where people are taking action, the people who work to change and upend the systems and policies that create the conditions in our neighborhoods in the first place, the people who are committed to developing more leaders among us. Because we're not fools. We know that a more just society is possible, and it's not going to happen if all we do is fund service provision. Right? We need to recognize that if the majority of local philanthropy dollars are going to service provision alone, it's akin to spending the majority of your health expenses on Band-Aids. A great example to highlight this is the millions of dollars locally that go to fund food distribution, which is an important initiative, but the almost $0 that go to funding organizations like those on this call or in the community that are specifically trying to push the state to stop the wave of evictions that are going to be slated to happen. You cannot tackle racial inequities if you just give out services. You begin to tackle them if you work to change the systems that created the inequities. And that comes from prioritizing organizations and helping build up the capacities for systems change organizations that are rooted in our communities to prevent these inequities from happening in the first place. And with that, I want to pass to someone who is committed to developing leaders in our communities, and that's Corey Davis with the Maven Leadership Collective.
Thank you so much, James. My name is Corey Davis. I use he and they pronouns. I'm the co-founder of Maven Leadership Collective. We bring equity to social entrepreneurship by investing in queer and trans social impact leaders of color and our allies to build more resilient communities that thrive even in the face of crisis, tragedy, and transition. Data permeates all aspects of our lives. This is no less true for the philanthropic sector. It takes on a particular urgency as government's receding social safety net shifts more burden to the nonprofit sector. Erasure of the LGBTQ community in data collection, particularly in the time of COVID, hurricane season, and the census, is a matter of life or death. The implications for not including the queer community in the nonprofit sector are numerous. Incomplete data masks the true need that exists in the community at large. For example, institutions that benefit from tremendous community trust, like the United Way, who publishes the Alice Report, an invaluable report on economic fragility, excludes queer and trans people of color from its analysis. Our community is among the most vulnerable and need that particular kind of analysis to be readily available to institutions and decision makers. The report is used in advocacy with the state and municipalities and with foundation decision making. Also, there's insufficient investment that is made by funders for small or grassroots organizations to adequately resource data collection that truly captures our impact. Queer and trans people of color and the organizations that serve our community have disproportionately balanced meaningful data, disproportionately balance meaningful data collection and impact storytelling against service delivery. According to funders for LGBT issues, giving to Black LGBT community is 5% of total foundation giving for LGBT issues. Innovation, resilience, and collaboration are all favorite buzzwords of foundations. This requires experimentation. Data is at the heart of that experimentation. Creativity, strategic decision-making are impaired by incomplete data. So what we're seeing then is that larger organizations, white-led organizations, are unfairly advantaged in this competitive race. Building movement projects working at the intersections, a survey of race in the nonprofit sector tells us that there is an anti-LGBT bias in the nonprofit sector, that sexual orientation is a compounding barrier to race and career advancement for Blacks in the nonprofit sector, and that representation of all people of color in executive positions has remained under 20% in the nonprofit sector for the past 15 years. So as we're looking at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, we understand that we must have a radical shift in our approach because what we're currently doing is not working. So research from Building Movement Project's Race to Lead initiative also found that 63% of people of color, leaders of color, cite lack of access to individual donors as a fundraising challenge, compared to 49% of white leaders who say this is a challenge. Similarly, 51% of leaders of color cite lack of access to foundations as a challenge compared to 41% of white leaders. Reconcile this with the fact that Board Source reports that 40% of nonprofit boards, of foundation boards, are 100% white. Echoing Green's recent study noted that 92% of foundation presidents and 83% of full-time staff are white. So what are the solutions? They must include shifting to really include more of those of us who live at the intersection of multiple identities, and those of us who are most impacted by the needs facing our communities to contribute to and design and lead the implementation of metrics and data collection. We also need to have greater funding resources for querying the data. That's really what this whole shift in thinking around data collection is, querying the data. and capacity building to learn and grow from more robust and complete data. The total foundation giving for LGBT capacity building has dropped to only 4%. So we can see the amount of resources that are available to organizations in order to make the shift that's going to be necessary in order to build out their ability to collect data. I do want to leave you with this one thought. Imagine you experience a trauma, an injustice, then you rise from it and create a solution to make the experience easier for others because the response you need did not exist. But you realize the response was never created with you in mind to begin with. You are overlooked, underestimated, and under-resourced. For queer and trans social impact leaders of color, this is an all too familiar scenario. For everyone else, it is a missed opportunity. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carrie Royce, President and CEO of the YWCA. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Good morning, everyone. Carrie Royce, President and CEO of YWCA South Florida. Part of a national organization, but here in South Florida, the YWCA has been around for 100 years. We're celebrating our centennial. That means that in our history and our legacy, we've seen so many changes. We've seen Miami transform. We've seen South Florida transform. We have witnessed hurricanes and devastation and just historic moments. And we've been resilient. We know that in South Florida, that race is complicated. Our YWCA pledges to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Through that lens of the complication of race, we also know that our stories are beautiful and that we all come from different experiences and places. We understand that funding is complicated, but South Florida is extremely resilient, and we've seen that resilience time and again. The resilience exists very specifically in the people that have built it, individually, who have come here, like my mother, who brought me here at the age of 13 and was, she was a patriarch. She is a patriarch in our family to have dreamt of a bigger future. So with that resilience, we have to put our faith in our community to find these solutions, and our philanthropic community has a great opportunity to lead the way in this conversation. We know that there are good people who are trying to do good work and that these resources are present. What we're asking is that, as Wakumi say, we push farther upstream and we think about where these issues are emerging from and how we together find those solutions, because a lot of the data that Corey just shared shows that the table has not been set for us to have a collective conversation and the representation isn't there. So in those solutions, what are we looking for? To continue to build an authentic relationship with Black-led and racial justice between Black-led and racial justice organization and the philanthropic and funding community, to walk alongside the philanthropic and funding community as we examine the tools and uproot the issues and dismantle any oppressive systems of funding, our funding structure. We want to eventually and always create legacy that's left when all of us are gone, because we intend to leave a better Miami, a better South Florida for those who come after us. And that means that we want a sector that recognizes the whole value of this community, of the Black community, as asset-rich partners with capabilities, strengths, expertise, contributions, and desires that are integral to the long-term and systems changes. And that we bring together our community around this common goal. We want to maintain, and we should maintain collectively, shared accountability. This is mutually accountable work. And we maintain that channels of communications and systems should be consistent, and it should examine continuously how we improve inequities in funding in any place that it exists. And we want to heighten the amount and effectiveness of sustainable funding for racial justice work, which we know has been historically underfunded. I'm going to pass it on to Brother Lyle, the Executive Director of the Circle of Brotherhoods, to close us out.
Greetings to you all who have joined, and obviously to my colleagues and comrades. Thank you for taking this stand. And when I mention taking this stand, again, I'm Brother Lyle Muhammad. I have the honor of serving as the Executive Director of the Circle of Brotherhood. And all of these organizations here have been tagged as been doing great work when it comes to racial equity and justice. If we're to be honest, some people just got involved in this work a few months ago when COVID-19 revealed disparities, when civil unrest because of the murder of our brother George Floyd uncovered and visualized things that we experience on a daily basis. We must say from the outset that we're very thankful to the Miami Foundation for standing up as a philanthropic arm and saying, you know what, all these other areas are being addressed when it comes to racial inequalities. We have to take a stand too, because we know that organizations who are doing this work 365, they're not being fully supported and funded. So we applaud them from that. However, let's not be mistaken. No organization on here or involved in here should be taken for just tokenism. We applaud the initial donation that Miami Foundation has given to each of these organizations, but until we're all fully funded and fully operational, we're not going to be able to do the type of work that needs to be done in our communities. And so don't go to sleep. There's going to be an opportunity for many more organizations and people to get involved. But this coalition that's been brought together, we will not let the mantle of equality and justice stop until there's full funding for those who are doing racial equity work in South Florida and across this country. So this coalition is here to stay. And if we're going to be dealing with these racial disparities, then we're going to be dealing with it in the philanthropic community and world too. So thank you, Wakumi, for your leadership. Thank you to the Miami Foundation again from the philanthropic side. And all of these organizations you see and hear from right now will not rest until we're fully funded and fully operational. And I think at this particular point, we're going to go back and get ready for some questions and answers. So do we go to Wakumi with that?
Santra. All you, Santra.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you to the panel, to the amazing folks who are making up this table. So there are a few comments in the chat already, and we're going to ask press, if there are any press that's among us as well, that they can drop their comments or questions in the chat, and we can definitely bring them forward so that the panel can answer. Question, Q Latin Trans Justice Funding Project, from the Q Latinx Trans Justice Funding Project. Is a 4% drop in capacity building support, Corey noted, relative to LGBTQ plus specific funding or from overall funding avenues? And that question is for Corey.
The drop is for all LGBT funding year over year in terms of capacity building. So from the top funders of LGBT issues, we've seen a decline in interest around capacity building, which I think has some implications for our ability to move forward, particularly as a capacity building organization, but also for what we realize that in a post-COVID world, in a world where people are starting to understand better that we need racial justice and dismantling systems, that's going to require a considerable attention to building the proper infrastructure, acquiring the talent, building new systems, and all of that is capacity building. And where our organizations are stretched thin already with service delivery and advocacy and systems change, there has to be a prioritization to give people more in order to achieve more.
There was another question from Adrian. He writes, I would like the panel to make some recommendations on how funders can work to undo the nonprofit industrial complex in South Florida. Are there any folks from the panel who want to take this question?
Yeah, just can say that some of that work is actually being started now. And again, you know, when you have a foundation like the Miami Foundation that says, you know what, no one else is standing up and speaking on this, we need to do it. And quite clearly, as they take the lead on that, other organizations are going to be called into question too. So just getting involved in this process. And I'll say in closing that we may not get this season again. So really, any institutional organization out there that is receiving funding from the philanthropic arm in South Florida, you should be speaking out on this issue as well and getting involved in it as well. But other organizations do need to take a stand. But I think this is the beginning of that unraveling. But we have to continue to organize and work together.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
I have a thought. Hers. My thought is, I think that philanthropy is one way that we fund our work. One thing that I know a lot of us on this, some of us on this panel are thinking about, and others of us in the community, is considering what are other ways that we can leverage community resources to be able to resource and support our work, so that we're not stuck in dependent and sometimes abusive and really difficult relationships with philanthropy. And so I think that a part of the conversation that I want to welcome anyone who's listening and folks on this panel to have with me is to think about what are other methods of funding. There's a beautiful brother, he's actually, I think he might be listening right now, Alan from Pong, who has a project called Old Money, New Systems, and is thinking about how do we structure nonprofits as worker-led co-ops rather than in this current way that they're structured right now. I think that there's a lot of different innovative solutions out there to think through how we can fund and resource our work differently. But we have to start having the conversations. As Brother Lyle said, this is a beginning. We have to start talking about it. And we need to start as executive leaders and as leaders in the nonprofit sector, we have to really start prioritizing having these conversations so that we can get off the hamster wheel with funders.
Yeah, and I would definitely add also with again, about our infrastructure and how we decide to build it out, and ultimately always the question on behalf of whom or with are we building out this work for. And so it's very important to be grounded on the ways that we can dismantle the nonprofit industrial complex by understanding that this is power with our communities, not power over our communities, which is the way that the nonprofit actually runs and structures itself right now, is that I'm working on behalf of a community and not directly with them. And so this is how we've seen this work basically stymied in our communities, is that we don't see that root causes of our issues and how we're addressing them for the long term, because we're kind of like bottlenecked in the way that we're doing this work. And so what does it mean to actually share power with our communities so that we're actually building out our collective work and being able to be grounded in what our agenda is. And so I know I can say for the Black collective, that is definitely something, as we have built out our organization, we have been very conscious about of how are we building out this space that it is shared ownership and that it is owned by the community and is not solely hierarchical, basically perpetuating the things that we are saying that we want to dismantle around patriarchy or white supremacy or hierarchies, and that we have to consider those things. And those are the things that we also have to challenge other organizations to consider as we build this out. And then again, as Brother Lyle said, is that we are starting to have these conversations right now. We are challenging foundations to think differently about how they resource our communities and resource the organizations that are in our communities. But that doesn't start without a conversation. And there's definitely things that we need to figure out. And, you know, this is like a call, not just to philanthropy, but also a call to other organizations that want to help us really think through what that actually looks like, because we are in a moment and an opportunity that we can seize to transform this.
I guess I would add also, Wakumi talked about this in the intro, about investing in Black leadership. You know, I've been in rooms where Black people have said that they don't feel like Miami-Dade is for them. that they feel invisible here. And that is the case. There are a lot of Black folks working in organizations who are doing amazing work, who are not included. When the funding comes about, they're never included. There are folks in organizations who will never be promoted. And we want to be able to talk that real talk and to be able to think about what does it look like for us who we know Miami-Dade County does overwhelmingly have a Black community, that they're not invisible, that they have a lot to add, and that they are the leaders and they are the ones coming up with the innovative solutions. And what does it look like for philanthropy, and not only philanthropy, for nonprofit organizations to elevate the work of these Black folks? Not only when it is the shootings that we know not only happens on this large scale, what we saw with George Floyd, but that happens every day in our communities, and your organizations are the one, our organizations are the one dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. And so what does it look like to fund us? And not only to fund us, but think of us as thought leaders, to think of us as the ones who are doing the innovative work, not from folks who are calling us from around the country, but for the leaders in Miami-Dade County to see the value of you all, my wonderful panelists, and the work that you all do. I know we're going to wrap, but I want to definitely hear from folks who are still on the panel, who haven't chimed in again. Because for sure you all are amazing. So from James, Ruth, or Corey, Carrie, if there's anything else that you all would like to add, here's your time.
I think I just like how impressed I am with the tapestry of work that has been done across the leadership on this panel as well as in the community. It's multifaceted, just like we just said about how the lives of people of color is multifaceted in this community. Everyone works from a different aspect, and it takes all of us, whether it's a national organization like YWCA or a local organization that's doing the work in the neighborhoods every single day as well, and to someone who's a staff of one who's doing this work in their local neighborhood. It takes everyone. And elevating and making sure that we create a table, which is what we've named this collective, that we're the South Florida Racial Justice Table, is because we wanted to deliberately bring all those voices to play and to make sure that there's relevance given and support given to solving solutions together with our community. So again, I just want to say thank you, because I think the collective represents the variety of work and voices in this work that's happening on all different levels and throughout our community. And that's also a part of the beauty of this. And I invite others to be a part of the table.
There's actually another question. So Lucy Segu asked, how can we get philanthropy to resource orgs that are more culturally rooted and not so corporatized? Who wants to take that? I'm looking at Ruth. Or Ruth, do you want to start? Then we'll come to you, Brother Lyle, as well.
Ruth?
Yeah, I can go. I hear feedback, so it's kind of hard to navigate and listen and also hear, but thank you for that question. I would say one of the most important things is living in Miami. Many of us are Haitian, right? Living literally on the other side of Haiti. So even when we think about Black and we think about folks across the African diaspora, it's understanding that we're literally the hub of culture, in rich culture in food, rich culture in healing, rich culture in everything that we do and everything that we are. And it starts with grassroots, and it starts with love of ourselves. The biggest piece of it that I would say, and it's interesting that this question came up, because a lot of this work, and even in the sharing that I shared earlier, is we live it. This isn't something that we're doing for people. If I'm talking about healing justice and taking care of other people, I'm taking care of myself every single day. And how I choose to do that is by story sharing. How we choose to do that is by healing ourselves and being in the practice, and also not wanting or needing white folks or philanthropy to be in it with us, right? Like that, like if we're, like I remember when I first started doing restorative justice circle keeping and community in Miami, it started with weeping circles. It started with knowing that we had to like literally cry and let it out and release it. And that doesn't actually need to be something that philanthropy needs to be a part of, but they just need to trust us, that they need to trust Black women, trust Black folks to be able to do the work that we're doing. And so I would say when we think about Blackness, like culturally rooted is like also to be able to see like who is leading the organizations and how are they culturally rooted within their own selves. And what is it that we're bringing across the African diaspora? What are the intersections of not just race, class, and gender, but then what are the intersections of spirituality, of the very essence of who we are, and how do we continue to practice that with each other, amongst each other, but really practicing it in a way where we can be our full, complete selves and not having to hide anything. But I don't necessarily think that philanthropy needs to be in it. They just need to trust us as we're building ourselves in it and as we are building other people.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Yeah, what I wanted to add to that question is so key. People need to understand what's actually taking place here. Now, I've been around for a few turns in the suns of civil disturbances and money going out to community organizations. And usually what happens is the organizations, they take their pennies and they run. Look what these institutions did here. The Miami Foundation stands up and says, look, this is unjust. Let's get some seed funding. They gave each one of our organizations $5,000. Now, we could have easily been like saying, oh, great, we can use it for this. The type of people you have on this line, whether it was $5,000 or $500,000, is saying no more business as usual. We're coming together so we can reshape this whole spectrum about who gets money, where it goes to, and who should be getting money, particularly when it concerns the issues. Family, look what you have here on the line. All of us do individual work, but collectively decided to come together because it's much more important than our individual organizations. And that's how we leverage that corporate power.
Yeah, I would just...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, James.
Just really briefly said, because I agree with everything that everyone said on the call. The only thing I would just add is the elephant in the room is our organizations exist because the state has failed our people, right? We are doing things that we don't necessarily feel like we should have to do. And the state has been set up in a way where it's designed to fail our folks. It is a lot cheaper for a wealthy person to give money in the form of a tax-exempt donation to a philanthropic agency as opposed to just paying their taxes, right? And I think as we're thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex, as we're thinking long-term, I think there's a lot of conversations we need to have with philanthropy, the role that they can play. But at the end of the day, we must recognize that when the state fails our people, philanthropy benefits, right? And that it's structurally designed that way because it's a way to kind of hide what are some of the root causes for why our folks even need organizations like this to exist.
And if I could add on with the comments that have just been shared, the net result is that we all become subject matter experts. The relationship between those of us who are doing the work and philanthropic organizations is that the power dynamic needs to be reevaluated. These are organizations that operate in the public trust. They actually benefit from our work, from our expertise, from our relationships. And we've seen that in recent months as they have come to realize that their relationships are not as deep as they are or need to be in order to execute that public trust and justify the benefit of that public trust, that they have turned to us more and more to say, oh, hey, can you connect us to this person? Or what is your thoughts on that subject? Or what is it? Because there should be always an ongoing conversation. And that the more that we come to reevaluate the authority relationship, the power dynamic between nonprofits and philanthropic organizations, to realize that really We know what we're doing. Trust those of us who have been doing this work. Trust the outcomes. Resource it sufficiently. I think you'll come to see that we'll be able to naturally flow to more culturally rooted organizations and to organizations that really have their fingers on the pulse of the communities who are in most need.
I'm noticing there are a couple of more questions. I know we're supposed to wrap up at noon. I see, Santra, do you want me just to name the questions? Okay, 2 questions. A question about what stops orgs from applying for funding and how philanthropy can help break down barriers. And how can organizations in Miami designed to help Black people remain sustainable in a city and a country that has in many ways allowed or even contributed to a declining Black population? This is the question. Where does that leave these organizations and what's next? Excellent, excellent, awesome questions. I want to say a couple of things on both of those. One, there has been excellent work already done by advocates in philanthropy across the country around barriers facing organizations. For Beth, I would encourage you to do a little bit of research, but also feel free to reach out to me. I can share a couple of more recent reports with you that I referenced in my opening remarks. Quite a bit of scholarship already exists on this. This isn't anything we have to reinvent the wheel on. And I think to your point, Gilbert, that's what we're here to work on. That's the whole question. So I know that Carrie Ann has a thought. We can get Carrie Ann's thought, and then we'll close out the press conference.
Just to piggyback on what you said, Wakumi, there are other foundations that have done incredible work around this and are looking deeply into it. As Brother Lyle says, we are in a moment. I would be remiss to not say that the Health Foundation of South Florida has really taken a look at this very deeply as well, and stepped forward like the Miami Foundation did in Broward County and in Miami. They stepped forward as well. So just wanted to add that the work is being done, and there's lots of scholarship, as you said, around this work. I want to mention the local organization like Health Foundation of South Florida that's also doing it.
So to your question, Gilbert, thank you for that, Carrie Ann. To your question, what's next is today, the South Florida Racial Justice Table meets with some of the leadership at the Miami Foundation this afternoon to forward this conversation and begin an ongoing conversation, an ongoing body of work with the Miami Foundation and others in the local philanthropic and funding community about what's going to be done about these racial disparities in funding. And we will keep the community posted. All of our contact information has been dropped in the thread by Christina Francois. So encouraging folks to please do reach out to us using the methods that are posted there. And we just want to thank everyone so much for joining in and spending some time with us to talk about this.
Thank you all.